in the room, Anxious Generation Part 2. So just to kind of give us a little bit of context, let me ask it this way. Is anyone here this week that was not here last week? Show of hands. Okay, so we have some new folks. Good. One of the things we're going to do is do a brief recap of some of what we covered last week to catch any new folks. And then we're going to shift a little bit of the focus, kind of just talking more generally about kind of what does holistic parenting look like, and then just some thoughts about what we've learned from research as it relates to faith development, so that when our kiddos get to that all-important launch phase, they have a solid foundation as they think about making their own choices about the path that they're going to walk. So again, we are honored that you're here. I'm Jeff Klein. This is my partner.
Hi, I'm Robin Guy.
And we are part of Better Life Counseling Center, just on the back side of the building right behind us here. And so we're honored to participate in this. We're basically in the series. This is our second night of looking at Anxious Generation, which was a pretty notable book that's came out in the last few years. And then let's see. We this past Sunday, we talked about, if we can go to the next slide, we talked about depression. And Mandy Young did a good job talking about that. This coming week, the Sunday morning offering will cover anxiety. And then the next 2 weeks in here on Wednesday nights, we are blessed here at Southwest to have a number of folks who have worked in the mental health field. And so we will have a panel discussion. So to help us, we ask you guys to please fill out some questions for us. We want to be able to give you guys some feedback. So if we'll move to the next slide here, we do have the QR code option. And what else do we have for those of us that still enjoy the more tactile version? You may see in the backs of some of the seats, or over here at the table, there's actually a black box on the table there in the entryway. There's a whole stack of these. So if you would prefer to fill out the old-fashioned questionnaire by writing your questions here, you can write your anonymous questions, either digitally or here on paper, and put that in the black box. And we look forward to those conversations to try to give just some practical responses to any and all questions you might have as it relates to parenting. All right, let's carry on. All right. Show of hands, who all's familiar with these characters on the screen? Ringing any bells? Okay. Several of you guys. So this comes from the movie Inside Out. So this is a really cool animated film that came out a few years ago. And really, I think, captures well what the internal experience is of kids, adults, people of all ages. So they've done a couple of these films, and it's just really showing you, like, what's the inner world look like? Particularly, with the principal character, how old was she? Maybe like 7 or 8 in the first movie, and now she's like 12 or 13 in the second one. I'm really hoping they just keep making these throughout her life. It's kind of cool. And this time they actually brought in mom and dad in the movie. And like, what are the conversations that parents are actually having as they're navigating the challenges of parenting? And so I think this just goes to show, there's just a lot of voices out there. As we're navigating the challenges of parenting, we have a lot of internal voices, right? As our kiddos are navigating all that comes with these different stages of growing up, they're dealing with a lot of voices. You've seen this one too, haven't you? What are your thoughts?
I love it. It's one of my favorites, particularly the second one, because if you have a preteen or a teenager and you watch this movie, you're going to go, oh my gosh, my kid did that or said that or whatever, because these new emotions are coming up when we hit that area of life, anxiety being one of them. The natural levels of anxiety we all experience when we hit adolescence. The other one I love, I wrote it down, I don't even know how to say it, the boredom / apathy. Have you ever had your kid be all excited and wonderful, and then suddenly there's like, yeah, whatever. I love that one because that's exactly what we go through. It's this roller coaster. And then the other one that I thought was really important was embarrassment, the social awkwardness, just always feeling like we're not quite right in any situation. So 100%. If you haven't watched it, please do.
Yeah. Your kids have never like act super embarrassed when you're in a social situation, just like asking for basic information,
Absolutely.
right? Y'all have never dealt with that, right? Where your kids are just like, oh, so embarrassing.
Yeah.
Just a
Or-
rite of passage. We've all gone through that.
Yeah, or if they're really hungry, but they refuse to go to the concession stand because they have to talk to somebody in order to order popcorn or whatever. And I'm like, well, if you're hungry enough, you'll go. And if not, I'm not ordering it for you. But yeah, just normal things that they go through that we've all been through. If you've been through adolescence, you know what these feelings are.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen the movie, check it out. It's a great conversation starter for your kiddos. Just getting their opinion on it, a lot of fun. Let's go to our next slide here. You know, one of the things we said last week as we kicked off the series is we don't want this to be just doom and gloom. Because I think sometimes we do parenting series and it's like, well, here's all the dangers in the world, and I feel really inept or inadequate to really know how to deal with all of these real world challenges. And I think that's a universal thing we can probably all relate to in some ways. The world's changed a lot. Parenting is challenging. But what we want to bring into this conversation is just look at the foundation of what is truth and what has truth been throughout time, and ultimately what does our Creator want for us to experience as we navigate just the challenges of living in a broken, fallen world. And one of my favorite passages here from John 10:10, this idea that Jesus told his followers, the thief does not come except to steal and kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. Do we believe that Jesus wants us to have abundant life? Absolutely. And so I think every generation of Christians has dealt with real world problems where we can struggle, where we can really get downtrodden about the state of affairs in the world. And guess what? Every generation has felt that way to some degree. And so what we have to really ground ourselves in as we're thinking about and talking about these real world challenges is ultimately the same Creator who spoke the world into existence is active and alive and present in our lives, is present in the lives of our kids. So while technology may have presented us with new challenges, the reality is we still have access in a relationship with our Creator, who is the perfect parent, who is with us and for us as we do this hard work of learning how do we navigate the complexities of this world with greater hopefulness, right? And the other piece here that I think is important to mention is, 1 Thessalonians 5:23 introduces this idea of what we would call the triunity of humanity. The idea that humans are made up of body, soul, which soul would capture like the mind, will, and emotion, so all of the internal things, and then spirit. And the other empowering thing here, think about this, guys. One of my favorite, probably my favorite chapter personally of the Bible is Romans chapter 8, which is just so beautiful in that language. But the idea that the same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in us. Now, that is a mind-blowing thing to think about, but producing fruits of the Spirit in our life and in our kids' lives is rooted in understanding that we have, and we are made up of a mind, a body, a soul, a spirit, and that it's the interaction of all of those things that often shape what our experiences are in this life. And so we just need to be mindful as we're navigating these challenges. We have an advocate, we have a helper, and we have a guide. And we have a Savior who wants us to live from this empowered position of knowing that we have been created for abundant life. And as much as the world is going to give us challenges and the enemy is going to continue to create challenges for us and our kids, we need to start from this foundation of just recognizing God's goodness in His abiding presence as we walk through some of these challenging topics. All right, now, this is the part we're going to do, again, probably like a 10 or 15 minute just recap of what we covered last week to just really tie some of those loose ends up and just drive home some of the points. And all of this comes out of a book called The Anxious Generation. And basically, this is a social scientist who spent the last 20 or 30 years looking at the impact of different trends on human development, in this case, specifically child development. And as we laid out last time, the world really changed in the last, 20, 30 years as screens have become on a different level impacting the way that we live our lives. So, quick recap here. What he found in his research is some of the dangers of excessive screen time. And this is particularly talking about the impact that it's had on the last couple of generations. So Gen Z, Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, Gen Beta, who is being born starting this year, actually. This is not going away. We're always going to have technology. So anything, if you're 29 or younger, you are in one of those generations.
Yeah, so these are kind of like what he's found in looking at, okay, what is the actual impact on mental health? So emotional, psychological health of this group of people who are essentially the first test case studies that have had a really close and sometimes moment-by-moment relationship with the screen. And so these are kind of the findings. And so some of this can feel a little bit doom and gloom, but what this is talking about is excessiveness. So if we are just giving our kid the phone or the iPad unfiltered, there's a lot of predictive outcomes that are not great to mental health. If we're doing all of the things that we're going to be highlighting in terms of like monitoring, having boundaries with it, I think the outcomes are far better. But Robin, what were just some of the takeaways here if we're having excessive screen time use?
Yeah, so it affects you, any person, us included, in multiple ways. So first we'll start with the physical. So we talked last time about brain development, how an adolescent's brain is very malleable, and so excessive screen time is really going to create differences in brain development than, again, previous generations ever had. Obviously, even just things like eye strain. If you've ever sat at a computer for any length of time and then walked away, you might have a headache, your eyes hurt, that sort of thing. That's happening to our kids right now. Obesity, this is really where we get into, because of the excessive screen time, we're not moving enough, we're not active enough, and so we're also not just getting the mental health stuff, but we're also getting just the physical changes in our kiddos. Poor sleep, particularly because we tend to use screens later in the evening at bedtime, and so kids are not getting enough sleep like they need. And then lack of attention and focus. I was thinking about an example of this one, and I don't know about you guys, but this is what happened in my house. I can go on Netflix and see like what has been watched, and every one of them has been watched for 15 minutes, and then he's moved on to something else. I'm like, you didn't finish that show. And he's like, eh. The ability to just stick with something and have attention has really gotten even shorter than it already was. So those are just some of the physical things that happen.
TikTok doesn't help when it's literally like 5 seconds,
YouTube
10-second
shorts,
videos.
All of those things are really affecting our ability to sustain focus. Yeah, for sure. Mentally and emotionally, obviously we talked last time about anxiety and depression being much more prevalent in our adolescents than previous generations. Things like self-image, all the comparison that social media can create for people. And then poor emotional regulation and control. So even when we become dysregulated emotionally, screen time doesn't allow us an opportunity to learn how to regulate ourselves well, to be able to calm and soothe whatever emotions we have. We're just going to move on to the next thing. And then coping skills, because a lot of times we use the screen as a way to cope, as a way to distract or escape. And what that does is it prevents us from really learning how to manage whatever struggle that we're having in life. So those are all the mental and emotional things that happen. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Social.
The social stuff, we talked about this last time, the limited face-to-face interactions. There's something missing when we aren't with people in our relationships, when it's just virtual screen-based kinds of things. Again, kids even learning how to order food properly or things of that nature I don't know, I'm thinking about a teenager who might have to call and make their own dentist appointment. You know, they don't know how to do that because we're not teaching kids how to be interactive socially, which actually leads to more isolation rather than less, and increased conflict and polarization. I think about this in terms of social media and how polarizing that has gotten with the things we will say online, but we wouldn't ever say to someone in person. And then just the tension that gets created when we're living in this virtual world.
Yeah, and here in a moment we'll talk a little more, the writer of this book, he's a self-proclaimed atheist, but he's also a social scientist, and he's looked at it. He has a deep appreciation for the importance of spirituality. So we're going to cover there's an entire chapter, actually, chapter 8 of the book, the spiritual implications that we're going to cover here in just a few minutes. So, Robin, here, let's kind of look at this next slide. Like, what do we do about all this research? So, last week, tonight, we've briefly introduced, here's what the data is telling us. If we're giving our kids screens that are unfiltered and they're spending hours and hours over years and years, we know it's not going to be good for our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being. So what do we do proactively to try to kind of create a home environment and an ecosystem that allows technology but does it in a smarter way, where we're making sure that we're kind of allowing there to be this more balanced life? So let's hit some of these things that we can do to be proactive and pragmatic about what we're creating inside of our homes.
It kind of seems obvious, but we really need to reiterate that we need to be spending time together, like literally in the same room, engaging in whatever activities your family enjoys, because we, again, have this dichotomy between the real world and the virtual world, and there's just something that's missing in the virtual world. So you want to be really proactive about creating space and time to be with your kids, your teenagers, even if they don't want to, in order to be able to cultivate that personal connection that you're going to want to have. That offsets the impact of the virtual world.
Yeah, this next one, can I be self-disclosing for a moment? Is this a safe place for me to do the counselor thing? This next one is one of the hardest ones. I read all this stuff, and I've been doing this, for a couple of decades, where, you get a degree in mental health, and they're basically like talking about all the toxic and evil things like technology. And my first default is just to be like, oh, social media is bad, technology is bad. And if that's just your kind of attitude and approach, you're probably not going to get very far with your kids in creating like a collaborative conversation, right? So I think we want to kind of pay attention to, we don't just want the takeaway to be social media is bad, don't ever do it, right? We want to make it more nuanced to where we understand as they get older, we need to first explain the reasons why we're going to have some of these boundaries with it, but we also want to get their participation. What are their thoughts and ideas about why having some balance or boundaries with technology could actually be good and healthy?
Yeah, when researchers have asked kids after the fact, like, what has been your experience of these limits that your parents have set that you all have figured out, like, what is best for you? 9 times out of 10, these kids are saying, actually, it's made me better. It's helped me, think more clearly, or I've been in a better mood, that sort of thing. So really, if you can give them the why of these, limits and the good, healthy boundaries, they're going to feel the effect of it, and that's just going to keep them on board to comply with what's really better for them. And also, when you're collaborating with your kids about this, we have to be ready as parents to do the same, to follow the same boundaries, to be responsible with our social media use, because it's not going to do a whole lot of good if we're like, okay, you need to limit this, that, or the other, and then we're not doing that as well. We've got to be good models of that. Mm-hmm. And then let's see, the last one. Yeah, just the extremes of it's not no tech, it's slow tech in a lot of ways, especially in the developmental periods. Things like graduated transitions from flip phones and things that have no internet usage and things like that, and slowly sort of exposing them to those things recommendations are like no social media before the age of 16 or high school, things like that. We just want to slow that down and slow their exposure to let their brains catch up to being able to know how to manage what's going to come with all that social media and all that internet availability. We put the world in the palm of their hand, and they're not ready for that, so we've got to slow that down.
Yeah, let's go to our next slide here. You know, this one's so important, and I think this is something that throughout their growth and development changes and evolves. Like, it's not just us dictating to our kids or teens, like, what right and wrong is. We want them to develop maturity over time of being more discerning, right? So part of that growth is, as whatever their developmental level is, for them to be a bit more thoughtful about what are the messages here. Right? What is it that is ultimately being communicated in the things that we're consuming, whether that's online, whether that's in TV shows, movies. And I just think when we're having those kinds of conversations, it's helping to shape the dialogue to where they're not just taking all of this in without filtering it some way. Right? What we want to be able to do is filter it. And I think we're all guilty of probably watching some things that it's not like every program that we watch is just filled with Christian programming, right? We all have to be discerning consumers of what we're watching. And so our kids, obviously, you know, they're going to be consuming different things. And so we want them to just bring more of that critical thinking into it, that throughout the times that they're watching things, what are the things that are good? What are the things that are healthy? What are the things that are similar to kind of what we believe and who we are, versus there's just no conversations or there's no filtering going on.
And if you think about a kid that's, 7, 8, 9, and how they think about the world and things like, they're very concrete in their thinking and not very savvy, of course, because they haven't had enough life experience. And the difference between that and a 17, 18-year-old, our ability to think at a higher level and think more abstractly, that takes some time to develop. And so, you get an 8-year-old that's watching YouTube shorts, and one of the gamers says they're going to give away $1 million, and they're like, oh, Mom, I need to sign up for that. They're going to give away $1 million, because they truly believe that that's exactly what's going to happen. And you and I know that that's not what's going to happen.
I'm still waiting on Ed McMahon to bring me the $1 million from.
Yeah. Well, someday Mr. Beast is going to show up at my house with all his candy bars and his, millions and a car and whatever else. But again, being able to not just tell them, oh, well, that's not true, but talk through, like, how realistic is that, and teaching them to be discerning about what they're consuming and, what to believe and not to believe. And I would even say this is true not just online, but with their friends as well. One of the things I have told my boys is, don't believe anything your friends tell you, because they don't know any more than you do. And so when they tell me, oh, so-and-so said this, I'm like, don't believe it. Don't believe it. It's not true. Because that's their influencer, and we want to help them discern that, okay, this is also a 10-year-old boy who, what more does he know than me, So I always tell them, ask me and I'll tell you the truth, but pretty much your friends are probably wrong. So that's discernment. Letting your kids know that you're always open and receptive to their questions and concerns. So this is where I tell parents, don't freak out. If your kid comes to you and maybe they have sort of run across something that they didn't intend to even, because that happens too, and they do come and tell you, hey, I saw this thing online or this thing popped up, our job in that moment, the best thing you can do is stay calm yourself, keep a hold of your emotions, and talk through, okay, when that thing happened, how did you handle it? What was your first instinct on what to do? If we do the opposite and we freak out and we, get all upset ourselves, what we're really telling our kids is, that's not a safe person to go to, because if I tell them something hard, they're going to lose themselves. So really being able to guide them through how to respond to those things when they discover stuff online or in the real world even. But also we have to be able to regulate ourselves in that moment. And then the last thing is becoming educated on what resources are out there. So what are your parental controls on your phone, your devices? Are you using a router that has good filters with it? starting with training wheels is what I wrote down, because there are some technology sort of resources out there that really, again, slow down their exposure to some of the things that they're not ready for. So some phone plans like Pinwheel and Bark and things like that are good places for younger kids to start, because you really get to gradually increase, their exposure, but really start small. And there's tons of stuff out there. I mean, go to the internet and look at it. It's out there.
Yeah, so anytime Robin and I, our colleagues, we get to talk about counseling, what is counseling? What's the benefit of counseling? One of the things that we try to share is, there's just a lot of different approaches to how we navigate life, right? And so counseling itself is a profession of holistic wellness. Like that's what we would call like our philosophical orientation. What does it mean to be a counselor? We are people who believe in people's ability to pursue healthy living. And so our role and our God is helping people to pursue living a healthier life. And that may look different for each person based on where they're at in life and what are the challenges in their life. But we really believe in the importance of like proactivity and prevention as much as anything, because the more that we're kind of viewing this from what we would call like a more holistic perspective or integrative perspective, the better equipped we are to model and then create a home environment that helps our kids just have a really solid foundation. So, sorry that the print's kind of small on this. I'll briefly just kind of go through our wellness wheel. So a lot of what the research shows is if we imagine like on a continuum, like if this stage is a continuum and, that end is like wellness. And what we would say by that is like the ideal of like optimum functioning, as good as we could function. And then this side of the room is like the opposite of that, impairment. So if we look at all these domains, people who report the highest levels of well-being are people that tend to have pretty high levels of functionality in these different domains. So we're talking about, social wellness, that we have relationships in our life that are nurturing, where we give and receive. Emotional wellness, that we have the ability to kind of regulate when we are emotionally distressed. And that would include a lot of different coping mechanisms, both ourself as well as social supports again. And next we have spiritual wellness. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Intellectual wellness, so what supports healthy, like positive self-talk, deals with our cognitions and our thinking patterns. Physical wellness, are we getting proper sleep, nutrition, those things that fuel our body are going to affect our mood. Environmental wellness. Do we have an environment that is safe and predictable? Financial wellness. And then occupational wellness. So to me, a big part of what parenting is, frankly, is life skills training. And the first laboratory for that is what we're actually living and modeling as parents. And that obviously, as we said last time, carries a lot of power and a lot of weight in influencing our kids. There's many things that are going to influence our kids, but all the research shows that the single greatest influence is going to be what is the culture of the environment that the kid grows up in. So if we are first and foremost modeling to the best of our ability well-being in these different areas, that's going to carry a lot of weight and influence of showing our kids what the good life, quote unquote, is all about. Now, is anyone in this room perfect? Of course not. And some of these variables are bigger than us. Like some of the challenges on this list of having well-being in some of the areas are things that we can't always change, control, or predict. But some of the other areas are things that we have way more influence on in terms of what are my kids observing every day about my well-being. And literally over the 18 or so, however many years we have a child under our care, every day we're contributing to that story and how we're living and what we're communicating in word and in deed. So I think a big part of this is if we look at what screens have done is it's kind of created imbalance, right? Because we could look at each of those domains, and if we're expending an excessive amount of time staring at a screen, what does that mean we're not probably doing? We're not doing as much socialization. We're not doing as much like free thinking and
We're not
being in nature.
Not moving as
We're
much.
not moving as much. So if we just kind of looked at excessive relationship with technology kind of disrupts what we would say is like wellness lifestyle. So it's part of this conversation about what does a balanced lifestyle look like and what we're modeling and then what we're trying to build into our kids' lives so that there's just less need or desire for things that we might say are unhealthy. And for many people, the screens become part of what we would call maladaptive coping. It's like, it's just an easy way for me to not have to think or feel. If I can just, doom scroll on my phone, I'm not really having to process negative thoughts or negative emotions. And I think that's part of where we see the negative mental health effects is if I'm just spending way too much time engaged in that, I'm not doing all of the things in a wellness perspective that help me have a healthier, balanced life in each of these areas. So I would just challenge you, we would challenge you, kind of be thoughtful about where do I fall as we're kind of laying out all these wellness areas. And on this continuum, there may be some areas that you're feeling like, oh, I'm really high, like in spirituality and emotional well-being, but maybe I'm not as strong in like the social well-being. So just do some personal inventory and then think about what are some goals that I could have or we could have in our household to bring a little more balance and a little more well-being in each of these areas so that when we then start trying to have the teachable moments with our kids, there's an authenticity and incongruence with that will then carry greater weight.
Yeah, you're always going to have more credibility with your kiddos when they're seeing you do the things that you're asking them to do, whether that's, again, screen time or physical well-being or eating well or having really meaningful relationships. So as you're talking about these things to your kiddos about why it's so important for them, really being able to say, am I showing them that with the way I'm living my life? And if the answer is, again, maybe not so much in certain areas, then we could all use some wellness in our life. We can all use some improvement. So choose an area and work on that for yourself. That's going to impact your kids in a very positive way.
Yeah, good stuff. So our next slide here covers an area. This is chapter 8 in the book. And again, apologize for the small print for those in the back. I'll kind of explain what we have going on here. But in chapter 8, the author has a chapter on what he calls spiritual elevation. And one of the quotes that really resonated with me, he said, the phone-based life produces spiritual degradation. And he basically says, so we have on the screen here an axis, an X, Y, and Z axis. So the vertical axis going up and down, hierarchy. The X axis has to do with closeness. So this deals with it says dimensions in social space. And kind of like what he's trying to say is that when so much of our lived experience is lived in a virtual space or with a screen, in a number of different areas, that's going to kind of pull people down away from the sacred and more towards what he called the profane. And where social media can be a cesspool for the profane is if I'm engaged in a meaningful conversation, like if Robin and I have different beliefs about things or ideas about things, and we're like, hey, let's go to Shadrack's and
talk about it.
Yeah, let's talk about it. And we're sitting across from each other and we're talking about, she's talking about her lived experience. I'm talking about my lived experience. Maybe there's some things where we have different beliefs or ideas, but there's a shared experience there to where hopefully if we're both being civil and respectful of one another, even if at the end of our conversation we're not reaching agreement, we could walk away saying, I felt seen and heard, and there was some civility and mutual respect in that. And what we found in this kind of new reality, this new dimension of reality, if we're spending so much time in these online spaces, a lot of the humanity is just stripped away to where people are now just engaged in their, in some cases, back and forth snide remarks, attacking people, giving their unfiltered, social political commentary. And it's not really leading to any kind of like enlightened experience, as the author would say. What it actually does is usually incite more resentment and frustration and negativity that then has a negative impact on our mental and emotional health. And so his example is excessive exposure to that. Not that we'll never do that, but excessive exposure to that moves people, again, more towards degradation than sort of this sacredness. And the way that he's defining these concepts is that essentially a movement towards the sacred would involve a lot of those holistic wellness things that we talked about, including the importance of spiritual practices. And so this is a person that's admittedly says, I don't have a belief in a religious worldview, but I have a deep reverence and respect for the positive impact that it has on people's lives because it's moving them closer to this idea of like a sacredness with the human experience.
I want to say something quick about again the things that we say. I don't know if you all have ever done this before, but if you see a post, particularly on social media, and it's even the tad bit controversial, do you ever go, "Ooh, let's see what the people are saying in the comments," right? Yeah, and you if you read 2 or 3, you're already seeing how we just change the way we interact with people virtually than we ever would sitting at a table talking about that issue. And that's not good for us to be exposed to that. It's not good for us to be engaged in that. And it is a degradation of who God intended us to be. So, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and let's move to the next slide, because if we kind of see, okay, our test study was like the folks that are basically 30 and younger, this is the culture. This has become the mainstream norm of how they've lived their lives. So they're experiencing this in real time, developmentally, of this kind of unfiltered world online where they're just seeing all of this. And so then the question is like, how is this then shaping and influencing worldview, what they believe? And so this came from the American Worldview Inventory last year, and it was really looking specifically at like Gen Z, Gen Alpha. Every generation here in the last 5 or 6 generations, we're finding is moving further and further away from what we would call like a traditional biblical worldview. So in all these surveys that Barna and other folks have done, when they ask these questions like, do you believe the Bible is true? Do you believe that it is a good guide for morality? All of these things, we see like the people who are maybe older demographically tend to agree with these things at a much higher rate than people who are younger. And so these are very broad, when we're surveying lots of people, you're going to get a variety of responses. But certainly what we see is this growing trend when we get into these questions of like morality. Less than half of adults embrace the Bible as their primary guide to morality. We grew up in a world where Judeo-Christian values at a minimum kind of shaped our culture in a lot of ways. So people had in many cases, like a shared sense of morality that had its origins in a biblical worldview. And with the rise of what we would call like the secular age is kind of like the opposite of a biblical worldview, and that's kind of been the unfiltered world that our kids have experienced. We've experienced to varying degrees, but developmentally, if you grew up in a world where there was less of that exposure, when your brain was being wired, when your brain was being developed in ways to where things like your core values were being formed, there was just a much stronger ability to kind of continue what we would call multi-generational transfer of beliefs. Where in a pre-internet age, it was more apt that teenagers and young adults might have some differences from what their parents believed, but there was more commonalities and similarities to what younger generations were believing than ever before. And what we've seen in the last 2 generations now is we're having more and more young adults no longer find agreement with just the fundamental beliefs of their parents, including parents who are Christian. And so when we start looking at it, part of what the author said is just because it's about the filtering. If there's no filtering and you're getting just bombarded with all of these messages, then our kids' hearts and minds are being shaped more by kind of like a secular worldview than a Christian worldview. So, for example, the other one, a large majority of adults accept the notion that as long as you do no harm, you can do whatever you wish. And then finally, a majority have, kind of not quote unquote non-traditional views about sexuality. They believe that lying to protect personal interest is acceptable, and if it feels good, do it, which are kind of like the basic tenets of a lot of the secular belief. And I mean, we're just using different language, guys. This goes back, read the Bible. Throughout human existence, there's been this tension between God kind of revealing his perfect will for his people, but then giving us free will to choose. Do you want to do what's right in your own eyes, or do you want to choose to honor me? Right? And the call of the gospel of self-denial is really hard, and it's always been hard, but I think it's even harder today because so many young people are essentially drinking the Kool-Aid of the modern current worldview, which would essentially a lot of the times be the opposite of what the Bible teaches. So if we go to the next slide here, again, if we just kind of look at the basic differences in a Christian and a secular worldview, when we're really trying to ground our kids in like the importance of the gospel, the importance of being people of faith, it's because we choose to believe that God exists and that God is good and that he's created us in his image, and that is good. And so when we're operating from a biblical perspective, it already provides answers to these core questions of life that every human has to deal with in their own time and way. So these questions of identity, who am I? Right? The question of what am I going to choose to believe, our worldview. And then finally, the question of a lifestyle. How am I going to choose to live? And so the reason the importance of seeing the Bible is God's divine revelation and absolute truth is it already gives answers to these questions, right? Now, God doesn't force feed us this stuff. He reveals it to us, right? Through divine revelation, both in Scripture and in his creative power and creating nature. There's many things that reveal God's goodness and his nature. But what's happened over the last 20, 30 years is we have more and more attacks on that and more voices essentially saying, live for yourself first, right? You can have your cake and eat it too, as they say. And so we have an increased number of people that like some aspects of Christianity, but only the ones that kind of fit our own choice and our own experience that then kind of gets prioritized around choosing to honor God. And so that's kind of what we're up against and what humans have always been up against. But the difference is, as I said last time, when I was 8 years old, most of the people that shaped my responses to these questions were my parents, were the people that I went to church with, were the people that I went to school with, who all had, some differences, but largely from a worldview perspective, there was more in common then. The challenge now is the people that are the primary influences of our kids are, yes, you guys and the people who know your kids in person, but once they start having a relationship with the screen, who is now influencing their growth and development? A lot of people who do not share our biblical worldview, which is why we really have to model and ground them in developing answers to these big questions at a young age and teaching them how to filter, because eventually they are going to leave your home and they are going to have to make choices about these big questions themselves. So I think the biggest task and challenge of parenthood in the modern age is how do we authentically continue to live out truth as we understand it, but then we have to be way more proactive in one, regulating and filtering their exposure to these different ideas, but then two, teaching them how to be much more discerning consumers of it, particularly when they get into that middle school age or high school age. Because I'll just tell you, in the last 20 years, the questions that I see teenagers wrestling with are completely different today than when I first started working with teenagers. When I first came into this field, it was like the Josh McDowell, let's do some apologetics. And that was sort of the conversation. If you could just prove to people that God exists, everyone was good. Now we're in just such a different reality that there are so many voices out there vying for our kids' attention. making sometimes very persuasive arguments that would just basically say, live however you want to live as long as it doesn't harm anyone. Why is it a big deal? And that's overly simplistic, but essentially it is that fundamental question that all humans have dealt with. Is God God, and I'm going to choose to honor him? Or am I going to live however it is right in my own eyes? And that has forever been the human struggle. I just think that because of the increased voices in the culture and our access to them at younger and younger ages, it's just made it more and more challenging, which is why we, again, have to model and be more savvy about filtering those influences that our kiddos are having.
Yeah, the next slide is really just all about that. And the only thing that I'll say is that it's strange to me now that being an influencer is now a job and a thing you can actually make money at, really. But this is again what our kids are dealing with. All of these different voices coming at them about who to be and what's right, and even discerning that those influencers don't always have their best interest at heart. They're there trying to sell a product or make money on what they're doing or whatever, and our kids can't discern that. So it's really teaching them to be able to look critically at those things and hold on to the influence of parents in our church family instead of the world. So.
Yeah, one of the strongest things I think that we can get here is I don't know if y'all can see this, but I feel pretty inadequate. Like this graphic, I think accurately represents, the transmission from Christ to Paul to me. But like as imperfect as we are, we still have a tremendous influence in our kids' lives, right? And I think the more, and this is why this authentic living out faith to the best of our imperfect ability is so important, because we want to shape our kids by making sure it's not just the absence of all the bad things. So the takeaway shouldn't just be, again, the overly simplistic, put our kids in a bubble and don't let them be exposed to the world. That's not going to happen. What it's really like, filter some of the world and then do what? Immerse them in communities of faith within your home, within our church family, and really make sure that the most consistent and persistent influence in their life is in relationships of people who love God and are choosing to honor and serve him. And I think over time, that has tremendous power. That has tremendous impact. So that then as the kids move into that adolescent phase, they have a way more solid foundation to build upon. If they have seen a with Christ life modeled by their parents, and then there's been all of these other community of believers that have poured in and nurtured our kids' well-being, so that when these difficult messages are coming to them, it's really this question of which has more influence, right? So there's all these cacophony of voices in the culture, but when they get to decision-making points, the real question is, which of these influences carry the most weight? And what we want for our kids is that how we've chosen to live and the people we've surrounded our kids with, that those voices will have more power and influence than the voices of the culture.
I think that's what the next slide, Sticky Faith. I don't know if any of you have read that book, but that's what this is really all about, is creating a model for how to live. I love the 5 adult rule. I would challenge you to ask your kids to name 5 people that if they were struggling with something that they would feel safe going to. And, you hope you're on that list for sure, but who else is on the list? Because what we know, particularly about adolescents, is that mom and dad are not 1 and 2 most of the time. Because those are hard relationships to have. So who are the other people? So ask your kids that question and see what they come up with. Do they have 5 people that they feel like they could go to talk about hard things?
Yeah, we want to create, and we went through this series, oh goodness, anybody remember the time? It's probably a decade ago. And basically this was all the findings that Fuller Theological Seminary was doing when they were looking at, like in Christian families, what are we seeing from the ones that are kind of like retaining faith and then authentically living it out themselves when they transfer from like their parents' home into young adulthood? And then what are the ones that are like their faith doesn't stick? It's kind of like their faith is just, it's kind of like taking on or off a jacket, right? It's not something that's sticking. It's sort of like, yeah, well, we attended church as a family, but it wasn't integrated kind of at like a level to where it was authentically being lived out and just part of who we are in an identity level. And so a lot of the findings of this book, I think, are still relevant today. I think there's a copy back there on the table. And I would say if you haven't read it, it's really good for us to kind of collectively think about. We want to create a culture to where we're really building relationships so that we have folks that can pour into our kids. Because I think as we've become a little more stressed out and have limited time or whatever, I think the tendency is parents often just try to do it all themselves. And the reality is, as they get older, you're gonna hit some of these stuck points in parenting that you need a fresh voice. And it's great when that fresh voice can be someone other than just the parents themselves. These need to be people that you trust. We're honored. I think the big part of why counselors, stay employed is we get a lot of parents that come in and are kind of like, hey, we love our kids, but man, we're really struggling right now. And we've kind of hit a wall to where as much as what we've tried to teach or reinforce, we're just getting nowhere. And we have all this resistance. And sometimes we try to be a part of that voice of either building a bridge in that relationship, or just trying to be another positive, affirming person in that kiddo's life, just to know that they're adults who care. And I think the more we kind of think about that as a church culture, and I think we do some good things like that. Like one of the greatest blessings for me over the last decade has just been being involved with our youth group and serving as like a core leader. And it's kind of crazy. It's like these guys who are seniors, I've been kind of working with these guys, Jim and I, for a while, and it's just awesome, the relationships that we built, and I hope will be sustainable over time as whatever they choose to do, enter the workforce or eventually go to college. I would love to be able to see how these young men continue to grow and mature over time, but I do think that takes a lot of intentionality, that we all look at who are my friends' kids that I can invest in, and who do I want investing in my kids? And then how can we be intentional about building enough of those opportunities for relationship building that we're creating this culture of sticky faith, that as they reach those important decision points, they have this solid foundation. And then the last part here is they talk about, just helping them plan for that transition. Mom and dad aren't always going to be there to be your alarm clock and force you to go to church on Sunday morning. That's going to become their choice, right? And so we really want to make sure, and this is part of where having the community of faith, really building in these relationships, those are other voices then that can be checking on your kid and maintaining those relationships and encouraging them. Hey, where are you at with Jesus right now? How are things going? Like that investment, that intentionality is so big. And this is where we can really be hopeful, is because so much of the research has shown when we do this, when we model these things and build this into our church culture and in our home culture, it really is encouraging to see that next generation growing and maturing as they're making these choices themselves, which, for those entering the workforce, we hope the local church will continue to build that. We're blessed to have an awesome campus ministry here, or across the nation, wherever your kids may go to school. Hopefully they'll get involved in some type of church or campus ministry that's kind of that next step of their faith development. Anything else? Now, our last point here, value of spiritual practice. This again comes straight out of that chapter 8 of our book, Anxious Generation, and these are some things that the author talked about are important, of moving us, away from profane into sacred. Shared sacredness. What are we doing right now? Right? Like literally being a part of a community of faith. Embodiment. This has to do with, again, sharing space with people, having actual face-to-face conversations and nurturing interpersonal connection.
Being with. Yeah.
Being with people. Stillness, silence, and focus. This is where we're getting into like the importance of spiritual disciplines. Spending time in prayer and scripture reading is not just an intellectual exercise. It should be experiential. when I'm spending time with God, that has a way of producing some peace within me. Because I haven't operationalized how the Holy Spirit works. I just know that if I start my day spending time with God in Scripture and in prayer, it's going to orient my heart and mind that I'm going to be able to engage with the problems and stresses of my life from a position of strength rather than feeling as overwhelmed. Because the moment I start thinking I'm going to have all the answers or solutions to the problems that I'm facing in that day, the more anxious and overwhelmed I'm going to be. If I can kind of slow it down, and I do all these weird, counselor things. I'm doing like mindfulness and meditation, and, this is how I have to start my day. That's basically inviting God in so that then I can release all the burdens and stressors that I want to carry with me, because I have to live out the serenity prayer every day to be sane and functional, right? So I'm going to ask God, give me the strength and wisdom to do the parts that I can, to enact change or be a person of influence. But the parts of life where I care about it but have no ability to change or control it, man, I have to put that on the altar each and every day, right? And to me, that's so critical here. And that's really where these spiritual discipline practices are needed. Transcending the self. This has to do with service. When we are doing things that are not just mind-numbing, that are actually enriching others' lives, that's enriching to us. Being slow to anger, quick to forgive. That's part of his point is, we don't see a lot of that kind of behavior in online spaces. And then finally, finding awe in nature. I'm convinced every time I'm in nature, my blood pressure and cortisol must go down because I just feel more relaxed, It's beautiful what God has created, and spending more time in that creation is good for our heart, mind, and soul. Okay, I think we've got it all, right? So again, I would invite you guys to continue to be a part of the series. We will be giving a paper copy of all these recommendations in the coming weeks, so you'll have access to this. Several of these books are on the back table. And then the final plea, since this wraps up kind of more of the teaching portion of the Wednesday nights, the next 2 weeks, Robin, myself, and a whole bunch of other people who are licensed counselors here at Southwest. I think there's 7 or 8, or do you know? I don't know. There's a bunch of us that are going to be fielding your questions. So please fill out one of those forms in the back. We'll put the QR code up again if you digital questions. Give us all those questions, and these again are anonymous. But we really want to make this series as helpful and pragmatic, so that if you have things that have came up that you want some feedback on, we're going to spend 2 full weeks just discussing with the panel how we might approach some of these real-world challenges that we're dealing with.
Yes, please. We want your questions. We want to be able to not just talk about even the things that we've spoke about tonight, but even any parenting question, really, any struggle you may be having with trying to raise a healthy kid. We want to answer those questions for you. So we want all of them. Give them to us.
All right. Let's go to the good Lord. Father, we are so honored to be your children, to proclaim your goodness, and to know that you've created us for connection. I'm just thankful for each person here, Lord. I know that we all have different burdens and struggles, but it's just comforting to know that as we face these real-world challenges, we're not alone, that you're here with us, that we can gain strength and wisdom from one another. And I just pray that you'll continue to speak through us in this series, just to provide that encouragement and support that we all need as we do this important thing of just pouring into and trying to influence the lives of the young people here in our homes, in our community, in our church. Help us learn ways to do that better. And we just want to give you full reign, Father. We want to ask that you will remove the power of the enemy and his influence in the lives of each person and each home that is here. And we just want, Father, for your Spirit, again, to have full reign, to shape our hearts and minds so that we can better model and teach your goodness to all of our young people. We're so thankful for this time to gather in your name, and we just pray all this in the strong name of Christ. Amen.